What's up everyone, it's Austin from Make Pop Music and Austin Hall Audio, and today we are back with another video. We get so many questions regarding music theory for beginners, how to utilize music theory in pop music. And while I think this is a really important subject, this is not something that I excel in, so I've never really done too much content on it. But with that said, we do have a special guest coming onto the channel to share their expertise. So today we've got our good friend Christopher CU coming onto the channel. If you enjoyed this video, go subscribe to his YouTube channel because he does a lot of stuff that is based around theory and based around composition. He's an amazing composer and producer, so definitely go check that out. And then if you like this video and you want more little tips and tricks, go check out the free pop theory handbook that he's got in the description below. You can go grab that absolutely for free. But without further ado, let's introduce Chris so he can start telling you guys some of the music theory basics for beginners and for pop music.
What is up, my friends? I hope you're having a wonderful day today. And in case you don't know me, my name is Chris. I'm a singer-songwriter, composer, and orchestrator. And it's an absolute pleasure to be back here on the Make Pop Music channel. Big thanks to Austin for having me back on. And today, what I thought I'd do is give you an overview of the music theory basics. Because a lot of producers and artists who are coming up, they can certainly write great music, but I really think that having a foundational knowledge of music theory and understanding how the language of music really works will seriously give you a leg up in not only the industry, but knowing actually how to craft better chord progressions, better melodies, and all that good stuff. So before we really dive in though, I want to give you a companion guide to go along with this, and it's totally free, called the Pop Theory Handbook. So if you click the link below, it'll take you straight there where you can download it, but it really contains some nuggets of information containing how to actually craft melodies and write chord progressions that actually stick with a listener. And we also talk about things like form and arrangement, so how all those things work together to really create a cohesive and satisfying result for the listener. So it's absolutely free. If you want to check it out, again, just click the link below, it'll take you there. And it's my thank you to you for checking out this video today. It should be a very digestible and easy read, so there's no reason to not grab it. So download that, and without further ado, let's kind of dive into the basics of music theory. I'll try to be as comprehensive as possible without dragging it on too long, but I do want to equip you with what you really need to know. So without further ado, let's jump on in. All right, so the very first thing I want to talk about is the layout of the keyboard and the very basic building blocks of music. So essentially, in music, we only use the first 7 letters of the alphabet, A through G. Okay, so there's 88 notes in total, but they're all just a combination of A through G that repeats over and over and over again. So A through G, A through G, A through G, and A through G, and so on and so forth. So once you kind of master the notes in one octave, which is basically from one note to the next note an octave higher, or 8 notes higher or lower, you're pretty much good to go. The range of the piano, like the number of notes that it has, is basically just to give you access to a lot of highs and lows as well, which makes the piano a very versatile instrument. But just talking about music theory, we're only using the first 7 letters. So let's kind of talk about what those black notes are, these ones over here that we see in between those white notes, right? So these are, the white notes are what we would call naturals. They're very natural and they're not being affected by anything. This leads us to the concept of the black notes, which first we have to understand the concept of steps. So half steps and whole steps. Half steps are when you go from one note to the very next note. So in this case, you see I'm going from C and I'm going up a note to the very next note. We call that a half step. If I go down a note to the very next note, there's no black note between the C and the B, but this is also called a half step. So anytime you go from one note up or down a note, we call that a half step, okay? Now a whole step is when you go up or down 2 half steps. So 1, 2, that would be a whole step. From C to D would be a whole step, or C down here would be a whole step as well. So I'm going down 1, 2 half steps, as you can see. Okay, so whole steps and half steps are the 2 main things you need to know about in terms of the steps. Okay, now this is important because this introduces the topic of sharps and flats. So sharps are essentially when you go 1 half step up or to the right. So if I start from G and I go up to the very next note, we call this a G sharp. Now the sharp looks like a little hashtag, but that's the symbol for a sharp. So G sharp, right? That's a G sharp. Or if you want to go down one, so from G I go down a note, we call this a G flat. And a flat just looks like a lowercase b. Okay, let's do another example. What would a D sharp look like? So we start from D, we find a D, we go up a note because we say sharp, right? So that's a D sharp. How about if I want to find an E flat? So I have my E right here, I go down a half step, and there we find the E flat. Now you might notice that I literally played the same note twice. Isn't that D sharp? Yes, but it could also be called E flat depending on which note you're approaching from. So if you go up from D, that's a D sharp, but if you go down from E and you want to call this an E something, it has to be called an E flat. So all the black notes have two names, right? Two possible names at least. Now keep in mind, these sharps and flats can also apply to white notes. So an E sharp would be an F, and an F flat would be an E as well, because there's no black note separating those two notes. So remember, a sharp and a flat is literally just going up or down a half step, or one note on the piano. So it can also apply to the white notes as well. Now this leads us to the concept of scales. So you probably heard of that word before, musical scales. And at its very basics, a scale is essentially 8 notes that are categorized by a pattern of whole step and half steps. So the two main types of scales you need to know about are the major scales, which are the happier scales, and then the sadder scales, the minor scales. So major and minor, okay? To build a major scale, the formula is very simple. You want to do whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Or whole step, half step, whole step, half step. If you're in the UK, I think they use a slightly different name. Tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. So they mean the same thing, but here I say whole tone and semitone. So whole, half, whole, half, or whole and half, I should say. Whole step and half step. So if we're starting on C, for example, C is actually the most important note on the keyboard. You probably heard of the word middle C. So that kind of identifies the very middle of the keyboard between the two staves in music. C is the middle note there. But we're not talking about notation today, but let's just talk about C, for example. So to find a C major scale, let's use this formula. From C, we go up a whole step. So 1, 2, right? So now we're on D. Then another whole gets us to E. Then we have half, right? So whole, half. So up a half step from E is F. Then we have another whole step to G, up another whole step to A, up another whole step to B, and then finally a half step to end on C. So just to recap, starting from C, we go whole, half, whole, half. Okay, now let's try this formula on starting on another note. Let's start on G, for example. So we go whole, half. So from B to C is a half step, right? Whole again, so C sharp to D, right? And then whole. Now whole again, so this time we're not going to play F, we're going to play F sharp, because that's a whole step from E to F sharp. Then we go to G. That's our last half step. So just remember that formula, whole, half, whole, half. And this is great because, again, this applies to every single major scale. It doesn't matter what note you're starting on, but as long as you use this formula, you are going to guarantee a major scale. Now you notice in the G major scale I just played, we had F sharp, which was the 7th note of that scale. So this means that the G major scale needs to have F sharp in order for it to be a G major scale. If we don't, if we play an F natural right here, then we just have a C major scale that just starts on G and ends on G. So that's not a G major scale. The G major scale needs to have the F sharp, okay? Let's do one more example. So let's start from D. So whole, see we're going to F sharp here, then half, and then whole, another sharp, so C sharp, and then D. And notice how D major now has 2 sharps. So if I play the scale one more time, see how it sounds very nice and pleasant, and along the way we played those 2 black notes, those 2 sharps, F sharp and C sharp. So then you might be wondering, does each individual scale starting on different notes have a different number of black notes in them? Like G major had 1 sharp, D major has 2 sharps, C major has no sharps, and the answer is yes. So every single note that you start on to build a major scale will result in a differing number of black notes, or sharps and flats. And so we'll dive into that a little further a little bit later when we talk about the circle of fifths, but just keep in mind that whatever note you start on, that will be the only scale that contains that many sharps or flats, that number of sharps and flats. So C major is the only major scale that has 0 sharps and flats, or 0 black notes in the middle, okay? Now let me talk about relative minors for a second. So we talked about major scales, but we haven't covered minor scales or the sadder scales. And the way you find those is you basically start from C, or you start from the major key, the major scale, so in this case C major, and we have to go to the left or down 3 half steps. So we go 1, 2, 3. And now we get to A. So A minor is the relative minor of C major, meaning that it has the exact same number of sharps and flats as C major, which is 0, right? We said 0, C major has 0 sharps and flats, and guess what? A minor also has 0 sharps and flats. Okay, and here how it's a little bit sadder, but it does comprise of the same notes as the C major scale, all the white notes. So the idea is every major scale will have its own relative minor scale, and both of them will share the same number of sharps and flats. So let's take a look at G major, for example. Here's the G major scale. Notice I have that F sharp there. Let's go down to its relative minor by going to the left 3 semitones, 1, 2, 3, or 3 half steps, I should say. Now, E minor should also only have F sharp, and all the other notes should be white notes. So from E, we go up to F sharp, then G, A, B, C, D, E, all white notes. You know? So once you start to understand the concept of the relative keys, the major and the minor scales having the exact same key signature, that's what it's called, the number of sharps and flats, we call that a key signature, then you can start to interchange between those two pretty easily, because both the major and the relative minor will share chords in common with each other, which is funny, which is pretty interesting. So speaking of chords, let's go over that a little bit. So assuming that we know our scales, let's say our C major scale, right? How many different notes are there within the scale? Well, let's see. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different letters in the alphabet, as we talked about at the beginning. Then if we play C, that's, again, repeating the same note as the very first note, right? So ultimately, there are 7 different notes within a scale. You can actually build a chord, which is like a series of notes that are played at the same time. You can build a chord on each one of these 7 notes. So starting on C, you can actually build a chord. And the way you do that is by stacking in thirds. So a triad is a 3-note chord. Again, a chord just being multiple notes being played at the same time. And chords are the foundation of harmony. So when you hear songs, you hear melodies, which is the thing that you sing, like, oh, Canada. And the chords on the bottom is like the things that make it sound good. Oh, Canada. It provides the background and the color for the melody, right? So to build basic chords, though, it's actually very, very easy. All you want to do is, starting from that note that you want to start on, you stack in thirds. So from the first note, you count the letter names. You go 1, 2, 3. So C to E is 3 letters, C, D, and E. Then from E, you go up another 2 letters. So E, you go F and G. So that's another third up, E, F, G. That's 3 letters, right? And here you have what's called a triad or a chord, a 3-note chord. And so this has a very kind of happy sound, actually. It's very bright. If I play it up an octave here, that's a very bright and open sound. So we call this a major chord, a major triad, all right? So again, we're in this key of C major. So this we call the C major chord. Let's start on the next note of the scale, D, right? Let's, again, build a triad by stacking in thirds. So D, E, F, that's a third. And from F, let's go up a third. F, G, A, that's another third. What type of sound quality does this one have? This one feels a little sadder, a little darker, right? This is actually a minor chord. So we call this D minor. Okay, so the 1 chord is C major, the 2 chord is D minor, the 3 chord starting on E. Again, we're building our triad, stacking in thirds. This one's called the 3 chord, and it's also pretty sad. So we call this minor as well, E minor. Notice the name of the chord is built off of the bottom note, which is called the root note of the chord. So we have an E minor chord here. Then we start on the 4th note, build the triad again. Take a wild guess at what this chord would be called. Well, what's the root note, first of all? What's the bottom note? F, right? So this one is going to be an F something chord. Does it sound happy or sad? It has a brighter sound to it, so this one's actually called an F major chord. Okay? Let's keep going. This is the 5 chord, or the chord starting on the 5th note of the scale. So this is a G major chord. Again, it starts on G, which is the root note, and it sounds very bright and very happy. So this is a G major chord. All right, let's move on. Starting on A, stack in thirds, and again we have a chord, but this one sounds pretty minor, pretty sad. So this is an A minor chord. We have one more to go. Starting on B, stack in thirds. This one sounds a little bit weird. It sounds kind of out there. And this chord is actually neither major nor minor. This one's actually called the diminished chord, diminished triad. And that's simply because of the distribution of the steps between those three notes, B, D, and F. There's a different number of half steps, for example, between these three notes compared to the rest that we've just played before. So all you need to know is that in pop music, we don't really use the 7 chord in isolation very much by itself. And you're really only going to be using the 1, 4, and 5 primarily, as well as the 2, 3, and 6 in some cases to kind of bridge the music together. But just keep in mind that the one chord is a very full and complete sounding chord because that's literally the home chord of the scale. The 1 chord will always be the home chord. Now, to contrast that, the 5 chord, or in this case, let's say the G major chord, right, is the furthest away you can get from the C chord. So this has the most tension out of any chord in the scale. And then after the tension, you want some sort of release. So usually you will get that release by going back to the 1 chord. So this is a very simple chord progression when you go from 1 chord to another chord, going from 5 to 1. You get a very complete sound because we're going from 5 to 1. I'm going from G chord to the C chord, which is the 5 to 1 in the key of C major. I hope that's kind of starting to make sense, the lingo that we're using. But these are kind of how the chords kind of work. So each chord has a different function within the scale. So again, the 1 chord is very complete, very solid. So usually if you start on the 1 chord and end on the 1 chord in a song, then it's going to be very complete. Let's go to the 5 chord again. The 5 chord is very tension filled. So usually after the 5 chord, we really want some sort of resolution. So naturally we can go back to the 1 chord. Another alternative could be to go to the 6 chord. So this would also give it some sort of resolution, but it's a little sadder of a resolution. Because remember, the 6th chord is a minor chord, right? In this case, it's A minor. So that's really important to know. Now the 4 chord is what we would call a predominant chord. So by the way, dominant, when I say the word dominant, that just means the 5 or the 5th note of the scale. So G is the dominant note in the C major scale. Okay, so some of these scale degree names, that's what they're called, scale degrees, they have their own names. They all have their own names. The first note is called the tonic. Then you have the supertonic, which is above the tonic. So that kind of makes sense. The 3 is called the mediant because it's the middle point between the tonic and the dominant. So mediant is the middle. The 4th is called the subdominant, which is below the dominant, right? So the 4th. 5th is the dominant. 6th is called the submediant, which you would expect to be below the 3rd, but it's not. Submediant, and then we have the leading tone, which is the 7th note. And the leading tone is called that because it really wants to lead up to the tonic again. But anyways, the dominant chord has a very, again, tension-filled quality, whereas the subdominant chord really wants to lead up to the dominant chord before resolving back to the tonic chord. Now this is obviously really cool because you can literally create your own chord progressions once you understand the functions of those chords. There are entire songs that are just built off of the 1, 4, and 5 chords because they all have their own unique purposes, like the 1 being so steady and the 5 being so tension-filled and the 4 leading to the 5. Then you can literally just go 1, 4, 5, 1, 4, 5, 1 over and over, and songs do that. But when you throw in the 2, 3, 6, and 7 in there as well, then it just adds more interest to the chord progression. So what I would highly recommend you do is go on Google, do a simple Google search, find the most common chord progressions, and then try to figure out what those are on the C major scale, for example. So for example, if you saw a chord progression like 6, 4, 1, 5, then in C major, you start from the 6th note. So the 6th note is A, so you would go the 6th chord, A minor. The 4 chord is F major because that's a chord starting on the 4th note. The 1 is the C major, then the 5 is the G major chord, right? So 6, 4, 1, 5. And then it's so fun because you can literally now write a melody on top of that. And a really simple way to write a melody on top of existing chords is to just assign a note in your right hand that already exists or already belongs to the chord in the left hand. So for example, if my 6th chord is A, C, and E, then my melody can start on A, C, or E as well. Let's say I want to start on C. So I can do a C chord, a C note in the melody. Then for the 4 chord, I can do C again because the C is also in the 4 chord. I can do C again because the 1 chord now has C as well. Now the 5 chord does not have C, so it's going to mismatch a little bit. Maybe I want to go to D instead. Now that sounds a lot better. So that would sound like this. If you want to put words to that, you could go, I like music, right? Very cheesy, but hey, like that's a very basic way to write a melody. Now, you can add more interest, so you could you could play multiple notes. You can go dun, dun, right? You can make up your own rhythms using those same notes, or you can experiment with other notes. You can go from C to E, for example, because both of those notes are in the chord, the A minor chord, and you can bridge them maybe using the D in the middle. So you can go, and you start to hear how it starts to sound like a melody, right? So a really, like just as an aside, a really interesting way to write a melody is find two target notes. So for example, if I want to go from C and then I want to go to E, you can bridge them together using the note in the middle. So in this case, using the D, which is called a passing note. So you're passing through the D to your next chord tone. Anyway, that's a little bit about chords and the functions of the basic chords within a scale. Now that kind of brings us to the circle of fifths, which is a very interesting way of organizing the different scales and different keys that exist on the piano or exist in music, but in a very systemized way. So let me kind of share with you how that works. If you take a look at the outside of this circle, you see all these black letters, right? So these ones represent all the major keys, okay? Again, major just means like the happy, the bright keys, the bright scales. And it's called the circle of fifths because when you start from 12 o'clock, which is where the C major scale is, we know that C major has no sharps and flats, so 0 black notes, right? Every time you go a fifth, so an interval of a fifth or 5 notes up or to the right on the piano, then we add 1 sharp to the scale. So let's use an example. We start from C, and the next note we see here is a G. So let's test that out. From C to G is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that's a fifth. Now it says G major has 1 sharp. So what sharp is that? Well, we already know from testing it out before using that whole half method that F sharp is the 1 black note, but we can also check using this diagram right here at the very bottom. So if we look down here, we see the G on the left. This is the G major scale. It is 1 sharp, and what is that sharp? It's F sharp, right there. Okay. Let's go to the next one, G to D. Let's test it out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's a fifth, and again, that's the fifth, right? That's according to the circle of fifths. So now we're on the D major scale, which should have 2 sharps. So we add another sharp. Let's take a look at the chart. D major here has 2 sharps, 1, 2, and those 2 are F sharp and C sharp. So it should be, there's my F sharp. There's my C sharp. And if you really wanted to check with the formula we talked about before, whole, half, whole, half. You see that it works perfectly as well. So that's the concept. It basically goes all the way until C sharp major, which is actually not listed here on the circle, but it should be. It's the equivalent of D flat major because C sharp and D flat are the same note. And C sharp major has 7 sharps. So that's the maximum amount of sharps you can have in a scale. And then on the left side of the circle, when you go down perfect fifths or when you go down to the left, so if we start from C, we go down a fifth, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We get to F major, which has 1 flat. And what is that flat? We look at the chart on the left here and we see the flat is B flat. So the F major scale is, there's the B flat, and that's the scale, the F major scale. So it has B flat in it. So every time you go down a fifth, you get to these notes and it has those corresponding number of flats, and you just want to make sure you play those number of flats to ensure that you are literally in that scale. Okay, so the C flat major scale should be the last one here, which is equivalent to the B major scale, but C flat major has 7 flats. All right. And then let's take a quick look at the red notes or the red letters in the middle. So these are the minor keys. These are the relative minor keys we talked about before. And again, just remember that every major and its relative minor will share the same key signature. So C major has no sharps and flats. A minor will also have no sharps and flats. And again, just to get from one to the other, just go 3 half steps or semitones down or to the left from the major scale. So from C, we go 1, 2, 3 to get to A minor, or vice versa to get to the major. So for an A minor, we want to go to up 3 half steps to get to C major. But again, you can see it's a really simple way of categorizing these things, these keys. And here's a little quick tip. I generally don't memorize the key signatures for the minor keys. I only memorize them for the major keys. So when someone tells me or someone asks me, like, Chris, what is the key signature of F sharp minor, right? So how many sharps does F sharp minor have? All I have to do is think to myself, okay, F sharp, what's 3 half steps up? 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3, that's A major. And I know A major has 3 sharps, which are Father Charles goes, or F, C, and G sharp. So I know F sharp minor as well has 3 sharps, you know? But that's a really systemized and organized way of looking at these different keys in music. And I think if you kind of internalize the circle of fifths and kind of visualize it when you start talking about music or literally just writing music, it can be very, very helpful. So by this point, you might be asking, how do I actually apply everything into practice? Like all the stuff we talked about today, like steps, scales, chords, circle of fifths, how do we actually apply all of that into music as a songwriter? Well, the best thing I can recommend, no matter what instrument you're playing, but preferably on a keyboard because you probably have a MIDI controller of some sort if you're a producer, is to get familiar with all 12 of your major scales first. Another way you could do it is maybe only learn a couple major scales like C major and G major, but then also learn those relative minors so you're familiar with the shapes of the minor scales as well. So for example, let's say I really want to get good at the C major scale and you want to know the proper fingering for it as well. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But there's plenty of YouTube videos on scale fingerings and all that, so you can definitely check that out. But make sure you're super comfortable with being able to play the C major scale in both hands, practicing one hand at a time. And then also practice the chords in C major. So the 1 chord, the C chord, the 2 chord, 3 chord, 4 chord, 5 chord, 6 chord, 7 chord. Be very familiar playing the scales and the chords of a certain key. And then do the same for the minor scale, the relative minor. So in this case, A minor. So A minor scale. Right? Then play the chords. So 1 chord, 2 chord, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and back to 1. Okay? And the rules of, the 1, 4, and 5 always apply. So if, let's say you're back in C major, if you want to create a chord progression using 1, 4, and 5, the most common one would be 1, 4, 5, 1. And you can just repeat that chord progression. You can literally record that into your DAW and then loop that over and over so you don't have to play it again with your left hand. And then in your right hand, you can start trying to think of a melody on top of that. So again, try to think of keeping chord notes with the actual chords themselves. So if I'm playing a C major chord, then my melody can start on C, E, or G. And then when it's time to switch chords, then you can switch to another note if you want to. Or if both chords share a note, like in this case, C major and G major both have a G, then you can stay on that same note, because it's a common note between both chords. But you see what's happening here. So I'm basically making up a melody off the top of my head, and I'm basically freely playing all the notes of the scale in the C major scale, but I'm just making sure that whenever I'm changing chords to a new chord, as soon as I play that new chord, my note in the right hand has to be one of those notes as well. So notice I'm playing a C and C is in the left hand as well. This will ensure that your chord and your melody sound good together. So as soon as you play the new chord, you want to make sure the note you're playing in the other hand in your melody is one of those 3 notes. D here, because there's a D here in the left hand. C here, because there's a C right there. See what I mean? And there's an A there, which matches this A in the right hand. So as long as you're on the strong beats, you have chord tones that are happening with the chord in the harmony or in the left hand, then you're pretty much guaranteed to have the melody and the harmony working together, which is something that we always are typically want, like 95% of the time when we're writing a pop song, for example. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Again, start with your scales, make sure you're very comfortable with even just the C major scale, get familiar with the different chords in C major, and then practice a relative minor. So the A minor scale, the A minor chords, and then practice maybe doing it with G major and E minor, and then start kind of improvising, come up with a chord progression that you like, trying to come up with a melody on top, or even do the reverse, come up with a melody on the piano that you kind of think is interesting, and then try to find chords underneath that fit that melody. you know, so you could do that as well. But this video was, yeah, basically intended as a primer of getting you the very essentials of the music theory. And if you have any further questions, I'd be happy to answer. So just leave them as a comment below. But I really hope that this video has given you some ideas today and has helped you with your music. All right, my friend, we've made it to the end. Congratulations. I hope you found it helpful. I hope it's given you a few insights to play around with. And please don't feel overwhelmed if it's too much information. Of course, you can always go back and rewind and rewatch certain parts. So if you have any questions or any comments about it, let me know below. I'll try to get into it and answer as many questions as I can. And of course, again, if you don't have the Pop Theory Handbook yet, I again want to offer that to you absolutely free. It kind of goes over my personal approach of how melody writing and chord progressions and harmony really work, and shows you how form and arrangement can really take all of that to the next level and form a cohesive and strong pop song. So I want to give that to you. It's my thank you to you for checking out this video today. Just click the link below. It'll take you straight there where you can check it out. And I hope you find it useful in combination with this video. Again, thank you so much for for having me on today. Really appreciate it. And I'll catch you in the next video. Take it easy, guys. Bye-bye.